Hey, since I'm in the middle of a few big projects, I'd figured I'd post a small compilation of the JoJo videos that I've done so far. Don't worry, I plan on covering the Pillarman and Poochie maybe in the next couple months, but since I was hacked last week, I needed to post some in-between content while I make new stuff and basically decompress. Thank you for understanding. I'm MangaKamen, and let's begin.
You can call me Yoshikage Kira. I'm currently 33 years old. Not that you'd care, but I reside in Northeast Morio's Villa District. Also, I've yet to marry. If I were ever to engage in combat, I would win the battle without question.
I think when it comes to villains in media nowadays, there tends to be a lot of trends that take away from the villainous nature of the characters. This isn't a new topic on my channel. It's part of the reason why I wanted to make videos talking about villains, rivals, etc. in media. More specifically video games, but I'm obviously going to branch out if this video's thumbnail and title doesn't give it away. One of these days, I'm going to make a full video about my issues with modern day villains writing. Which, hey, if you guys are ever interested, let me know. But enough of my shilling. I think it says a lot that one of the more intriguing elements to villains is how much of a threat they are, and how they are actually treated as a threat in their own story. It's part of the reason why I was drawn to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Like, you can probably point to a lot of issues with the series, and I've got my own criticisms, but one of the most attractive aspects of the series is the villains. The villains are probably some of the best that fiction can offer, whether it be their designs, their over-the-top personalities, their powers, or even just their character in and of itself. Of course, there's going to be a lot of debate and disagreement on who is and isn't the best villain. A lot of people attribute... Oh, right. I guess spoilers? I mean, we're talking about a particular villain in this video and his name and face is in the title and thumbnail, so you're really coming to a video to complain about spoilers? Of course they are. They always are. I should also say that while I will talk about some aspects of Kira, I do expect you guys to have some knowledge of the JoJo franchise. Not just part 4, mind you. Regardless, today we're talking about Yoshikage Kira. Now, whether or not you think he's the best villain in JoJo, I'm not here to argue that. That's not the point of this video. The point of this video is to analyze Kira and talk about why he's an effective villain, especially in today's modern media. I say this because while we did get the animated version of JoJo Diamond is Unbreakable in 2016, 7 years ago, ugh, I'm old. The original manga for this part of JoJo ran from 1992 to 1995, so technically speaking, Kira's an older villain before the turn of the century. And during that time, well, you could get away with a lot more than what the more modern writers and villains could. Like getting off to the Mona Lisa's hands. God, I hope my neighbors didn't hear me when I said that. But here's a question. Who is Yoshikage Kira?
I'm currently 33 years old. Not that you'd care, but I reside in Northeast Morio's Villa District. Also, I've yet to marry. In order to make a living, I work for Kameu department stores. After a long day's work, I return home no later than 8 p.m. I don't like smoking, but do enjoy the occasional drink. I'm always in bed by 11 p.m., and I make it a point to get no less than 8 hours of sleep each night.
If that little monologue seemed to be a bit too mundane to you, that's because that's the point. On the surface, Yoshikage Kira is a normal man who wants to live a normal, quiet life, free from the worries that life can bring. Oh, and indulge in his... Yeah, Kira is a serial killer, one who's been doing his dirty deeds for decades in Morio, and until 1999 he had been successful. For the most part, and due in part to his stand ability, Killer Queen. It's an interesting change of pace for the JoJo characters in the prior parts, specifically the villains. Unlike Dio and the Pillarmen, who had much more grandiose desires, Kira is a much more down-to-earth villain. He's not looking to take over the world, he is not interested in becoming stronger, and honestly, once we get to the second half of the series, the chase after him is quite intriguing, but I'll go more in depth with that later. To make a bit of a long story short, Kira has one simple goal in life. To live a quiet one, to avoid confrontation and again indulge in his vices. Kira tends to be a bit more tame and subdued, especially when, say, compared to Dio. With a few exceptions, like when he's certain that he'll win, he tends to be calm, cool, and collected. And when he does break out into the hamminess, it tends to be done in a more outlandish and terrifying manner. It's also thanks to the voice acting that helps sell this. I know I just used the original Japanese for that clip, but I also want to take a moment and note the English dub voice actor. I know there's quite a bit of a contrast between subs and dubs, but in all honesty, I do appreciate the English dub, especially Kira, who is voiced by DC Douglas, which, if you're not familiar with, is one of the more prominent roles would be Wesker from Resident Evil.
I don't need anyone else. I have big balls.
The way he portrays Kira as a regular person really does fit, but also has this floating dread in the voice work that sells whatever Kira says as a very demented person. I just want to bring attention to the excellent voice work in both versions of the show. Hell, I really do enjoy the English dub for Part 4 overall, because there's a lot of fun moments and execution for the series is really good.
For the love of God, drop the meat!
I also want to draw attention to Kira's design. Now, there's a lot of influence of David Bowie in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I just realized I live in a world where a lot of people probably don't know who David Bowie is. God, that Reaper is inching ever so closer to me with every passing second. I can almost feel the scythe on my neck. David Bowie, aka David Robert Jones, was an English singer, songwriter, and actor who was regarded as one of the most iconic musicians of the 20th century. Thank you, Google! He was a really interesting musician who basically reinvented visual presentation and stagecraft. The guy clearly had an impact on the musical world, and the guy had a very impressive career while he was alive. And considering that Araki, the author of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, has a fascination with music, as shown with all the direct musical references to characters and stands, Vanilla Ice, Crazy Diamond, REO Speedwagon, King Crimson, Foo Fighters, Weather Report, Costello, friggin' Dio! I'm just saying it wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility for Araki to take influence for character design from an actual person who had a major effect on the musical world. More notably, Kira takes influence from the Thomas Jerome Newton persona from The Man Who Fell on Earth film, which David Bowie played. Kira is blonde with blue eyes. He dresses in regular formal suits. Well, regular in the world of JoJo, especially when comparison to everyone else's clothing in the main cast. It adds to his aesthetic and main goal of wanting to live a quiet life and not stand out, while still maintaining his facade of a normal guy so he couldn't be ripped away from... Let's talk about Kira's power. Killer Queen.
Deadly Queen.
Doesn't have the same ring. For those who aren't familiar with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I apologize if you aren't, stands are manifestations of a person's soul, each with their own unique abilities, strengths, and weaknesses. Granted, every stand has a use. It's just that some tend to be more suitable for combat, others for tricks, and others for traps. Strength and weakness don't really apply for how a stand can be utilized. Kira's Killer Queen is a powerful stand with its ability to turn anything it touches into a bomb, blow up anything, and not leave anything behind. It's a handy ability and one that works for Kira's advantage, as he doesn't want to leave any evidence behind of his crimes. Well, save for...
It soothes my soul and brings relief to my restless spirit.
But then again, he can make the hand fizzle away at any time he wants as well. And while Killer Queen is a strong stand against other combat-oriented stands like Jotaro Kujo's Star Platinum or Josuke's Crazy Diamond, it lacks raw power. However, Killer Queen has additional abilities that play to Kira's strength. Sheer Heart Attack is a remote stand that can operate independently from Kira and also provide a bomb attack. It's also near invincible, but can only attack things with heat signatures. It's a powerful stand, but also has limitations to it as well. Then we get to Killer Queen's third bomb, Bites the Dust, a very powerful ability that Kira can imbue into another person, and should anyone try to learn Kira's identity, it activates. It blows up the person who learns the secret, then creates a temporal loop for the person who is being infected with it, and returns the host back to about an hour before the bomb goes off. To make it clear, Kira gets this in the later half of the series, and after he goes into hiding as another character, Kosaku Kawajiri. Right, should probably bring that up here as well. After a run-in with Jotaro Kujo and Koichi Hirose, along with Josuke Nokuyasu appearing soon after the fight, Kira had to go into hiding. He did this by utilizing another stand user's ability to steal a face from another person, Kosaku Kawajiri, and thus he was able to hide away. During this time as Kosaku, Kira had to deal with not only becoming a totally different person, but also had to hide his murderous tendencies. As we learned through the investigations from the protagonist, we learned that Kira is a creature of habit, and has a weird tick that is tied to his murdering desire. The longer that Kira goes without killing someone, the faster his nails grow. and as they grow rather long and have been quite a bit, to the point where he makes it a hobby of his to collect the clippings in small jars. Yeah, I know, it's JoJo. You gotta expect this kind of weird. And during this time while Kira was hiding as Kosaku, the longer his nails grew, the more that his desire to reveal the real Yoshikage Kira to some girl grew as well. In case it wasn't apparent, Yoshikage Kira is a demented serial killer, under the guise of a normal person, but will kill plenty of women and take their left hands as his girlfriends, preserving them until they begin to rot. That is Yoshikage Kira. As I've said, Kira is a more down-to-earth villain, and it works with this part. And this is a personal aspect, but one of the many reasons why Part 4 is one of my favorite parts of JoJo is that there's a stark contrast to the previous part. Part 3 was essentially a around the world in 80 days adventure, and Part 4 was a more down-to-earth feel with the localized location of Morio. The previous villain, Dio, was a 100-year-old vampire, and meanwhile, Kira, for all intents and purposes, is just a random person who got lucky, has a little cunning, and of course a powerful stand that allows him to indulge in his vices quite easily. The element here is, well, human. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate Dio and the Pillarmen, they are excellent villains in of themselves, but Dio had rejected his humanity and the Pillarmen weren't human. Kira is just a human with a stand, mind you, but he doesn't have any real aspirations and willingness to take over the world. If anything, it also plays in the element of Part 4, since his mundanity of just living in Morio gives a bit more of a creep factor to the villain because he just blends in. Like, if you look at a character like Dio or Cars, they're very iconic, but their designs are very outlandish and they tend to be very boastful for their desires so everyone can be aware of their intentions. In contrast, you've got Kira, a serial killer who could be anyone in town of Morio. Hell, the town in of itself doesn't even know that there are serial killings going on because of Kira's ability to blow the people into nothing. If you really consider it, if the plot of Part 4 worked for our protagonists, Kira could have just killed off countless young women in Morio and nobody would be aware of it. Whereas, if you got the more exuberant villains who stand out, the point of Kira is to blend in with the crowd. He comes off as mundane and uninteresting, even to the point where as a kid he didn't stand out too far and came in a lot of competitions in third place so he wouldn't stand out. A face in the crowd, as it were. We live in a large world, and it's easy for people to see who are in the spotlight and determine whether or not they're good or bad people. But the people in the street? Well, they're a mystery as to who they really are. You never know what masks people wear when they're in public, and who they really are in private. It's the unknown, and that's a good element for a villain, because on the surface, they are living a charade to hide the true self, to be a mundane and uninteresting so he couldn't stand out and draw the attention of others, all the while hiding his true form. And that is what a true monster is. Kira's design also adds to this. Sure, Kira is a handsome man, but doesn't really stand out from the rest of the cast in Part 4. If you were to compare Kira to a lot of the other character designs, they did have a lot more outrageous elements, and make them stand out. For example, Josuke's got his hair and pins on his uniform, Okuyasu, or Rohan's hair and accessories. Kira's design is rather plain, especially for JoJo standards. The most he gets is a killer queen tie, and it isn't until he acquires Bites the Dust that his hair changes into a more drastic and unique styling. Before he gets the boost to his stand, Kira tends to be a lot more stoic and less really enraged. It's what really made Kira stand out as an antagonist in JoJo, since I've been saying he only has one goal: to live a quiet life. And funnily enough, Kira does get what he wants when he changes his face and becomes Kosaku. He got everything an every average person wants. He's got a home, a job, a family. There's just one problem. That's not his life. He can no longer be Yoshikage Kira. He has to take the life that he stole and leave Kira locked up in a cage within himself. And that's hell for him. You watch as Kira slowly begins to grow more and more unsettled. All because he can't contain his vices, his habits, his desire to show the real Yoshikage Kira to someone.
We're all forced to live out our lives concealing our deepest hopes and fears. But to forever keep them to yourself, can one truly live out their days behind such a veil of secrecy?
For all extents and purposes, Kira has what he's always wanted, a quiet life. But it's not his. and it burns him up inside that he has to control his urges. And you can't help but watch, holding your breath as you see him edge closer and closer to reverting to his true self.
Do it. Bare your heart to her. Show her your true self. Yoshikage Kira.
The funny thing is, if Kira didn't kill people, he could easily have his quiet life. And here's the thing, Kira doesn't have a traditional tragic backstory. If anything, he was a spoiled brat, and even in death, Kira's father was willing to allow his murderous son to keep up with his terrible tendencies, creating a monster in the process. If you were to say compare Kira to Dio and their backstories, Dio was living in squalor and an abusive household, having to gamble over chess games to earn any sort of money. It was a life that turned Dio into a bitter person who was willing to throw away his humanity due to how crappy humanity had treated him in turn. Meanwhile, Kira is essentially a spoiled brat. Kira's family was well off, and he essentially got a full-on home when his parents passed away when he was younger. And when he got his stand, Kira was capable of indulging in his murderous vice and being able to easily eliminate his targets without any evidence that could lead the police to him. Both characters are terrible people, and that monsters can be created from anywhere, and that even spoiled brats, those being handed anything they want at a young age, can be just as bad. It's a message that shows that parents do need to set boundaries and not allow their kids just do what they want. Bit of an extreme case, I'll admit, but it's still a message to consider, especially since Kira can be a very entitled person, wanting a quiet life but willing to snuff out any young woman's life who catches Kira's eyes. While it's not the traditional tragedy that we're used to, it's still tragic in a means that Kira's fetish that had a mundane start, but his parents did nothing to really help their kid as he got worse and worse. If anything, Kira's father Yoshihiro pampered Kira, and that in turn turned him into an entitled serial killer. Enabling is another form of neglect since it isn't actually nurturing a kid. Which leads us into the next section. Now, as a villain, you need to make them a threat to the protagonist, cause if they aren't a threat, then what's even the point? Well, you wouldn't be a villain, you'd be a joke. So in order to be a productive villain, you need to be able to establish a threat to the main cast, because if there's no stakes that the villain creates, again, what's the point? For Kira, we got a few ways as to how he's a threat. The mystery of who he is, where he is, and his versatility with his abilities. The first two go hand in hand. If you're looking at the anime version of the part, we're introduced to a severed hand that breaks up the mundane morning and the colorful setting of Morio. This shows the audience that there's a dark shadow looming over the regular town, and it's one that the normal folks are completely unaware of. An evil that you're not aware of is one that really works well, especially in a narrative. We're told of him when the cast meets the ghost of Kira's first victim, Remy. After that, the crew actually comes across Kira incidentally.
Now take a deep breath. He's managed to avoid the police for over a decade, and they're supposed to be the best. It's not like we're gonna summon him like waving down some taxi by force of will alone. Let's stay calm and take things slowly and carefully. So, what did old Rohan have to say?
He said the same thing as you, Josuke.
Be careful, Koichi! You have to be alert when you cross the road!
I'm sorry for the trouble.
Of course, they don't know Kira's the culprit. They just think he's another person in Morio. But that to me speaks of how dangerous Kira is, that you can be so close to a monster and not even realize it. It's really the unknown factor that plays a key role into this killer of a character. Of course, we need to discuss the other reason for his threat level, his versatility with his abilities. Killer Queen on its own is a powerful stand. Like, when used properly, I think it'd be argued to be a very potent one as well. It doesn't have the ability to stop time, erase time, or see the future. Rather, it has the ability to turn anything, living or inanimate, into a bomb, all with a single touch. Said bombs don't seem to affect the environment, and despite the loud sound effects, are apparently silent to people. I mean, if they weren't, then that kinda would announce to the world that tactical nuke incoming! But all in all, it's a terrifying stand that can be extremely deadly, especially since it can vaporize people within seconds when the bomb goes off, even more so when Kira can turn the bombs to be detonated at will or have them be triggered. Granted, this ability has a few weaknesses to it. If Kira or Killer Queen cannot press their thumb against their index finger's middle phalanx to trigger the bomb's detonation, the target cannot blow up. The bombs have similar properties to incendiary bombs, which means that it requires air to be used, and only one bomb can be made at a time. Even with these limitations, Kira is able to make use of the ability. After all, most of the time, part of the strategy in JoJo is understanding the capabilities of stand users. And anything being a bomb is something that most people wouldn't be able to plan against, and if they do, it'd be more paranoia being a factor, as anything could be turned into a bomb that could kill you almost instantly. Kira's other ability, Sheer Heart Attack, is a branch off Killer Queen, acting as a remote stand that has a similar ability, and although it's near invincible, it isn't the greatest automaton, where it can only track heat sources and attack them. Then there's Bites the Dust. I've already explained it, and considering that this ability can be only undone if Kira removes Killer Queen from its host or if Kira dies, it's a very powerful ability. Later on in the final fight against the JoJo the Part Josuke, we see Kira use another stand user, Stray Cat, to turn invisible air bubbles into floating bombs. This shows that Kira can think on his feet and use any advantage that he can. Then again, even as a villain outside of combat, Kira has also been shown to be an analytical person. He's able to think on his feet rather quickly. For example, cutting off his hand in order to have Sheer Heart Attack go wild and act as a decoy so he can escape. Granted, backfired since Josuke's crazy diamond ability to recombine the hand to Kira happened and led them to him, but even that worked in Kira's favor, since the person losing a hand can be a signifier to lead people to find Kira even after he changed his face. Back to my point, Kira is also a threat as we see him use his power against a powerful stand user, Shigechi, Kira being able to outsmart and kill him in the span of 5 minutes. And we managed to establish Kira as a threatening villain, just like that. Of course, when you have a villain, you also need a hero to face against said villain. And some of the best heroes versus villain dynamics also make sure that both parties have a clear opposition between the two of them. This can be done as simple as conflicting designs, like for example having a character wearing red fighting a character wearing blue, going with the blue oni red oni trope. Or their abilities are conflicting with each other even though they do have similar sets as well. It could be something as simple as using a similar weapon. And the same can be said for the main character of JoJo Part 4, Josuke Higashikata. I will say, one of the biggest criticisms that I have with Part 4 is that Josuke sometimes falls out of the wayside of being the main character in his own part. I'm not saying that he gets shafted the whole way, mind you, he still has a lot of awesome moments.
Crazy Diamond!
God, I still love that scene being animated years later. But there was a bit of an oddity of Part 4 with Josuke as the main character, and one that I do hope to make a video about, because I do like Josuke as a main character, but he does have his flaws in his own story, and if you're interested, please consider typing in the comments, Crazy Diamond! And if we get about 10k likes on this video, I'll make a video talking about Josuke as a character in the future videos. But for the purposes of this one, if we compare Josuke and Kira's designs, you can already see that their design work, they do oppose each other. Josuke's color palette is much darker with his outfit and hair, meanwhile Kira's blonde hair and lavender suit bring this into as well. They're conflicting color designs due to how their brightness and darkness works. Hell, the designs themselves can also do this too, since Josuke's design in and of itself is that of a Yankee, basically a Japanese delinquent, and as such is seen as a troublemaker and a stain on society. In opposition, Kira's clean-cut suit and his job as a salaryman make him out to be a respectable Japanese member of society. Of course, we as the audience know this is to be the opposite. You also have to consider their abilities. I'm not going to rehash for a third time about Kira's abilities, but for the sake of brevity, I will with Josuke's. Josuke's Crazy Diamond is a very combat-focused stand, having some very powerful physical abilities to it, such as strength, speed, and precision. But it also has a secondary ability, Restoration.
Crazy Diamond! 直して材料別のところまで戻す
It's an ability that allows Josuke to do quite a variety of things, but to put it simply, Josuke has the ability to repair organisms and objects. This can also revert chemical changes or turn things back to their base components. And if you're like, Angelo, you get turned into a rock. I'm sure with that description, you can see how this ability is diametrically opposed to Kira's. Kira's ability is all about destruction. Meanwhile, Josuke's ability is about repairing. The two characters are essentially direct oppositions to each other, and when the two do meet in the final confrontation in the part, the battle between them is a real nail-biter. Not only because both of the users use their stand abilities in very creative ways, but also because their fighting styles actually clash very well. Getting back to how they use their stand abilities in creative ways, Kira using the aforementioned air bubbles to attack Josuke from a distance, and Josuke uses his own blood to shoot glass tracking bombs to get Kira from a long range as well. It's all the more satisfying to watch Josuke land blows. Of course, I've got my criticisms of that too, but that's for another video. Remember, 10k likes. In any case, even when he gets bites the dust, this dichotomy between Kira and Josuke makes more sense, especially since Kira's outfit and hair go to pure white at this point. Well, save for the black streaks, but you get the point. And frankly, I kinda wish we had more confrontations between Josuke and Kira, because when you think about it, they do have a good hero and villain dynamic going on here with these design elements. But I'm sure there's a question on everyone's mind right about now after watching everything that I said in this video.
Okay, but why though?
I make it no secret that I love talking about villains on this channel. Hell, rivals too, and I'm hoping to expand more into character archetypes and subtypes in the near future. But to propose the question again, why is Kira a good villain? It's because he doesn't fall into the same trappings as a lot of other modern day villains have, and he breaks the mold for what a lot of JoJo villains were up to this point. I've already extensively explained that Kira as a villain in comparison to the major antagonists in JoJo is different, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But what do I mean with the breaking of trappings of modern day villains? Despite the fact that JoJo Part 4's initial manga run between 1992 and 1995, the official anime adaptation came out in 2016, 7 years ago. Kira's model of a villain is reminiscent of the 90s elements because he was from that time period, and it shows. The guy is a psychopath. He doesn't have the traditional tragic backstory. He has style, he has his own goals, and most of all, he comes off as an actual person. What I mean to say is that he has flaws. His entitled attitude as a character has clearly given the guy a superiority complex, as demonstrated when he underestimated Jotaro Kujo when he was wounded. And then... or when he believes that he outsmarted Hayato and allowed his ego to get the better of him, that he proclaimed his name, allowing Josuke to hear it. These are idiotic aspects to Kira, but that's also the point. Kira isn't some vampire chess master, nor is he a battle-hardened warrior like the Pillarmen were. He was a spoiled brat. And here's the thing, while that was his major weakness, it wasn't used as a joke. A lot of villains nowadays are made to be incompetent, or they do things that are so absurdly stupid that it makes you wonder how they even succeeded at being a villain in the first place.
I'm going to leave them alone and not actually witness them dying. I'm just going to assume it all went to plan. What?
Kira isn't a perfect human, and it's his ego that gets the better of him, but he still had a lot of moments of competency and was a real threat. He isn't made into a joke character, he's an actual threat, and the chase after him is an actual goal that you can root for. It also reflects how Kira is a villain. His strength comes from his ability to hide in the shadows, even reflected in his abilities, creating a bomb from an unknown object, using the long-range sheer heart attack, and even bites the dust to hide his current identity from the people chasing after him. These are abilities that allow Kira to not actually fight directly against people, and despite his words to Shigechi,
Of course, if I were ever to engage in combat, I would win the battle without question.
it's reflective of a cowardly narcissist, and it's reflective in his abilities, actions, and behavior. It's a rarity to see such a villain like that in modern day, and frankly, Kira isn't a modern day villain. As stated, he's from the 90s, and it shows. He's a disgusting human being, and for a villain, that's great. I've talked about good and bad villains for a while, and frankly, I believe that Kira is something that a lot of villains nowadays should be. Absolute scum, but with a misleading outer shell. Powerful, but not perfect. Have flaws, but not have the flaws override his high points of being a villain. And of course, His death is iconic for this, because he dies twice. Kira gets the ending that he deserves, with his first victim getting her revenge, and Kira being dragged to hell, where he can never have a quiet existence. It's something that a lot of villains kinda deserve nowadays, but a lot of villains either get redemption, or their deaths are less impactful. And Kira's death? It's satisfying. Yoshikage Kira is a good villain. He fits with the smaller, localized setting of Mario. He has an amazing power that fits for not only his desires, but also his character and representation as such. But he's also just entertaining. Now, whether you agree with me or not, that's up to you. I'm sure that people will probably say that in comparison to other JoJo villains, Kira is lacking, and perhaps you're right. I'm not going to pretend that Kira's writing is perfect. Trust me, I don't think that he's a perfect villain, just that he's a villain that's done right. But regardless, I want to thank everyone who watched this video, and hopefully we can do more videos like this where we talk about villains specifically. I'm still working on the AI character video, so expect that next month, and thanks again for watching. I'm MangaKamen, and remember...
At that time, I was very weak. Lacking a body made me vulnerable. If I had not taken Jonathan Joestar's body, if it hadn't been for his energy to augment my own limited source, I couldn't have survived at the bottom of that ocean for 100 years.
I have a confession to make. I love villains. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone coming back to this channel. Hell, probably some of my favorite videos have been delving into the insanity of villains. And I like villains as they can come in many different shapes, sizes, shades, and some other word that begins with a letter S that escapes my brain at the moment. A few months ago, I talked about one of my favorite villains, Yoshikage Kira. He's probably one of my favorite villains in JoJo, not counting the future antagonists in the manga that haven't been adapted yet. He's also what a lot of villains should strive to be as well, and probably one of the better villains in media. And yet, I wouldn't say he's the most iconic villains in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. No, that would go to the one, the only, Dio. To make it clear, I'm talking about this Dio, not this Dio. This one, not this one. Yes! No. We good? Good. I'm MangaKamen, and...
Are you ready to rock, boys and girls? I said, are you ready to rock?
Dio Brando, the man, the myth, the legend. But who is Dio? Well, to be frank, he's probably one of the most iconic villains in all of anime and manga, and he happens to be what a lot of villains should strive to be as well. Dio has this charm to him. He's over the top. He actually manages to be a threat, extremely entertaining, and even after his canonical death in the series, his legacy still managed to affect it afterwards, and even influenced pop culture for years. Damn these memes, but they were still influential on the internet and certainly drew more people to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Before actually getting to the canonical origins of Dio from a story perspective and why he's a great villain, I want to take some time and talk about Araki's choices when it came to creating Dio. According to the interviews in the JoJoium with Araki, he took inspiration from FBI profiling of serial killers, pointing out that they need to have a level of strength in order to commit the heinous crimes that they do. It should also be known that Araki also looked towards serial killers who controlled their victims through psychological manipulation, a similar ability that Dio himself showcases throughout the series. How he's able to really tempt those who work for him, scare other people, and of course, playing mind games with other characters. FBI psychological profiling was a hot topic around the time that I wrote this. Why do serial killers do what they do, scientifically speaking? I was inspired by that when I was working on Dio. Guys like that are true scumbags, rotten to the core, yet I've always sort of thought that they are actually incredibly strong for being able to commit such crimes. Why do they go so far? Do they do it just to see if they can? The control aspect of it interests me as well. Dio's physical appearance was taken from pop culture, in this case, the character Roy Batty from the Blade Runner movie, the 1982 version, the good one. This is in line with a lot of Araki's works of inspiration, taking things from pop culture and retooling them for his work. As I've said before, he did the same thing with Kira, and in one of the many interviews that Araki gave, he said the following about Dio. I mentioned this back when I was talking about Jonathan, but Dio was actually the one I want to draw the most for part 1. How far can a man's ambition drive him when he takes it to the ultimate extreme? One of Araki's goals with Dio was to showcase just how far a person was willing to go for their ambitions, even going so far as to throw away their humanity and kicking a dog.
Ready, Ike? Kick the baby! Don't kick the baby. Kick the baby.
And that's intentional. Araki wanted to make Dio inexcusable. A lot of villains will justify or excuse their own evil. You've probably heard the whole spiel of everyone's the hero of their own story. Villains don't see themselves as villains. You know, that whole thing. But when it comes to Dio, that phrase is bullshit! Dio as a character is someone who, while having reasons for his actions, he doesn't apologize, he gives no excuses, and he'll gladly give you a smile, all before he throws a knife at your throat. There's just something about seeing a character who smiles a lot, whether that smile is for good or bad purposes, that makes you want to like them, even if they happen to be a psychopath. Araki loved to draw Dio. You can see that with every panel that he shows the character, and Dio is a visually appealing and interesting person. Dio's also a guy who will just sip wine as one of his lackeys just casually cuts his own head off at Dio's request. But now that we've got a good idea of who Dio is, let's talk about how Dio is.
Shall be the key. Now burn!
Born in the year of 1869 on the cold streets of London, Dio as a young man was raised for the first 10 years of his life by his abusive drunk father, Dario, and even lived through the death of his own mother. This is pretty much all we really know about Dio's past from the manga and anime. Aside from the fact that he earned money by playing chess, Araki has also stated that he doesn't like to go too in depth with villains suffering while showing their backstory, since, well, they're the bad guys, and logically speaking, the heroes do need to defeat them after all. It wouldn't do too good for the villains to become overly sympathetic for the character that is supposed to be defeated by the heroes. However, from what clues we are given by Araki's illustrations and writing, we can glean some information that's below the surface. Take for example the first sentence I said in this section. Yeah, that one where I was a dork trying to be overly dramatic. Even the setting that I gave, the time and place, can give us an idea into the backstory of Dio, as well as his motivations in part 1, and even going further into the future where parts where Dio is still alive in. Year 1867 coincidentally lines up with the Reform Act of the same year, where it was essentially a time where classism and the right to vote in the working class was null. This was a time and country where classism and obviously living conditions that weren't the greatest for those in the lower classes existed. Considering the context that we're given in both the anime and manga, we can see that Dio wasn't really all that respectable and probably lived more on the streets. And with an abusive father, we can really see the beginnings of a broken young man. Oddly enough, Dio does showcase a lot of signs of abuse victims. Not to claim I'm some sort of psychologist on the internet like most YouTubers, but a quick Google search does show things such as destructiveness, low empathy, cruelty, and other assortments of the big brain words that make the YouTuber look smarter than he actually is. Duh. Even considering the time period and location, it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination that Dio grew to resent any and all those who are on a higher class than him. And it's that resentment that allowed Dio to essentially do whatever he could to escape his situation. In a sense, it's just the willingness to survive. And a cornered animal will do anything to survive. Dio as a child was broken down mentally and physically, and why he has such a misanthropic view on humanity, one that carries into his actions as he poisons his own father and by the grace of God or a devil, is brought into the Joestar family. Considering the background and upbringing, it wouldn't be any surprise that Dio would hate the Joestars. For all his life up to that point, Dio was suffering at the hands of fate, and the world dealing him a terrible hand. Meanwhile, Jonathan was given a privileged life. When Dio first meets up with Jonathan, the young blonde writes off Jojo as a spoiled rich brat. And he's not really wrong about that, since we are shown scenes of Jojo acting as such. Dio doesn't see another kid. He doesn't see someone who could potentially be a friend or a brother. He just sees a stepping stone on his path to the top. And incidentally, lashes out on Jojo in a similar vein as what Dio had experienced when he was a young kid at the hands of Dario. You better not act high and mighty just because I'm staying in your home. I don't let anyone swagger over me. I mean, Dio really doesn't know Jojo at this point. He doesn't know Jojo as a person or a character and doesn't make an effort to do so. If anything, this bleeds into Dio doing similar crimes against Jojo that Dario did, only to an extent that's a little bit more. Killing Jojo's dog, intentionally trying to physically assault Jojo with dirty tricks, and of course...
It was I, Dio!
Ironically enough, it's a cycle of abuse that Dio was perpetuating. It was due to the inability to trust in people, and one that's not completely unfounded. Isolation makes a man hollow. Speaking from experience, are we, Dio? Dio got what a lot of people wouldn't be able to get, even in today's world. He got a second chance at a good life. Jojo and his father George were willing to take him in as one of their own family, but the scars of Dio's backstory pushed him to view those two as nothing more than the rich elites that looked down on him, even if they didn't actually do so. And unfortunately, eventually, something breaks. Honestly, one thing I need to point out with the manga, and in the place of the popular anime adaptation, is that the manga we get is a bit more defensive pose that Dio takes here. With his arms crossed, his tears a lot more prominent, and even seeing his body shaking, you can see that this really does affect Dio, that a spoiled brat that he had written off had just kicked his ass. It really solidifies in my mind that Dio was a broken young man who wanted to inflict the same pain that he had gotten onto someone else. And it's at this point that Dio changes. Inflicting this kind of pain wouldn't really work against someone who has proven that he is willing to fight back and can beat him down. Again, this is what I have managed to interpret from Dio. Backstory and actions do have on-scene information from them that allow me to infer more aspects of Dio's character in a more hypothetical standard. And I should point out that Araki's characterization still makes Dio to be a straight-up bastard, especially after the time skip in part 1, where Dio plays a bit more of a subtle game, switching his tactics instead of poisoning George in the same way he did with Dario. I think we should talk about George Joestar for a moment when it comes to Dio's backstory. It's actually rather important in regards to Dio. As stated before, Dio got a second chance at life, but the wounds from his former life and father certainly interfered with that aspect, even when there was a more, positive father figure in his life. I hesitated there for a sec because George is a different kind of bad father, not so much abusive or a drunkard, but because he was kind of blind to what Dio was doing, as well as using a switch on Jojo for getting a question wrong, and even starves Jojo over bad table manners. This did actually get Jojo into a prime mindset for Dio to take advantage of, but also take this thought into account. How would Dio ever respect another father, especially one who treated his own flesh and blood like this over things that are really that minor? With the phantom of Dario hanging over Dio's shoulders, it should be obvious that Dio would have a bad view of fathers especially. Hell, Dio even blamed Dario for the death of his own mother. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the scene where Dio was stumbling in the streets after Jojo discovered his plot of poisoning George, mirroring the alcoholism that Dario had. It's really interesting to consider that as much as Dio hates the blood of his own father that flows through his veins, and ironically enough, Dio inherited a lot what made him despise Dario. Got Dario's cruelty, his conniving nature. Remember, Dario was willing to rob a dead man at an accident. His sadism, his greed. Hell, if it wasn't because of fate, an actual thing in JoJo, mind you, Dio would have been in the exact same place as Dario had been, a drunk in the gutter. Now, all of this is a reason for why Dio does the things he does. However, they aren't an excuse. At least, not to an outside viewer like you or me. Or that one guy in the back. Down in front! Dio, though? Yes, he believes that his past of why he is the way he is, and that those who show him kindness haven't had a taste of his own life and are only for him to use. And Dio doesn't think of himself as a bad person. And I know what you're thinking, and typing down below, because that directly contradicts what I had said at the beginning of this video. What did I say again? And that's intentional. Araki wanted to make Dio inexcusable. A lot of villains will justify or excuse their own evil. You've probably heard the whole spiel of everyone's the hero of their own story. Villains don't see themselves as villains. Oh yeah, that. And you'd be right. Except that, my friends, is basic humanity. But the Dio I'm referring to at the beginning...
I reject my humanity!
When Dio kills George, using his blood to awaken the power of the stone mask, that's the moment that Dio truly throws off the shackles of his past, his lies to everyone, and becomes an immortal vampire. There's a line that I honestly find intriguing from Speedwagon before this happens. He was born evil. Normally, I hate lines like this, mainly because it stems from the idea of nature versus nurture, where bad behavior is ingrained into a person's very essence and soul. Personally speaking, I believe no one is born evil or good, and that we entered this world as a blank slate. But enough of my moral grandstanding. The phrase actually describes what Dio does. If he was born evil, then there's no reason for him to keep his humanity. After all, if you were meant to be an evil person, you might as well not be human at the same time. And with his humanity now stripped from him, Dio can finally be free. He can be himself, and he can indulge into every vice and no longer make excuses for himself. After all, if he was born evil, he might as well go all out, right? Why not consider yourself top of the food chain? After all, from Dio's perspective, humanity has looked down upon him, and now humans have become his cattle. So obviously he's the superior life form, right? No one tell Dio about cars. There's a lot more to Dio that we can talk about, but we're specifically focusing on the past for this section, and to explain that while Dio does have a tragic past, the moment he discards his humanity, he discards his excuses for the things that he does. He removes his fears, and as such, he no longer needs to be chained down by his human nature, and become one of the most iconic characters throughout the series.
Again. Just now, a most intense feeling like someone somewhere is watching me.
I think he's talking to you.
As I've stated before in other videos, a villain needs to be able to be a threat to the heroes. And since Dio has about 2 different modus operandi in the 2 parts that he was actually alive, and had different abilities, I think we'll focus on that aspect. I alluded in the previous part that Dio often had to rely on his own intellect, and play a bit more coy with his goals of attaining the Joestar fortune. But all of that changed when he gave up his humanity. It's nearly impossible for a regular man to kill a vampire, at least in the world of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, at least a normal man. Not to say that Dio's own mental faculties were completely eliminated from when he became a vampire, but it was clear that his focus had changed to a bit more of a power focus. I mean, the guy could shoot pressurized jets of fluid that acted like high-pressured water cannons and could freeze people by the mere touch. He also had the ability to create zombies and then later full-on vampires so he could create more lackeys as he saw fit. There was a lot more egotism when Dio became a vampire, and it's obvious to see that when he came to his fights against Jonathan, it's what he calls anything that Jojo does.
It's useless, 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 useless!
Doesn't have the same sting of Muda Muda Muda, now does it? Still, when Dio does gain his vampiric powers, he essentially goes,
"Don't care, didn't ask, cry about it, stay mad, get real, Elmald seed cope."
But as we all know... Of course, when he lost his body and became just a head, Dio had to resort to more backhanded tactics, and that still didn't work out too well for him, at least for 100 years. We then get to part 3 Dio. Well, in the timeline there's a fair bit where he spends time with Poochie, but that's not the point for this section. With a newly minted ass...
But he's got a nice... Yare, yare.
Dio had to hide more into the shadows while his body recovered, and as such had to rely more on outside help, with a new power from stand users, which was an ability that Dio also received when he was back in the world of the living. Funnily enough, the eye beams and the cold abilities were just gone. Granted, what Dio got in return more than makes up for it, but for those abilities to just disappear, especially since he could do the eye beams when he was still ahead, I'm just nitpicking at the moment though. Let's talk about Dio's stand power. There was a bit of a fan theory that I do want to bring up, and that's that Dio was supposed to have these stand abilities that were all showcased. This theory stemmed from 2 aspects. The fact that Dio was able to have a variation of Hermit Purple, and the second being that his Arcana was that of the world. The first is kind of self-explanatory, since stands are supposed to be unique manifestations of their user. Although this one is more often countered with the fact that Dio is using Jonathan's body, and that's his stand that Dio is using. Whether or not that's true, well, I don't really know or care. But let's take a different look at the world. In the major arcana, the world often refers to a reflection of the journey that a person takes. It would make sense if Dio had the abilities of the previous stand users, since before reaching the actual second half of the arc, the stands were based on the arcana of the tarot deck. Well, that was thrown out the window when the Egyptian stands were introduced. Still, here's where we can look towards the actual abilities of Dio's stand, the world. As anyone who knows anything about this show knows, the world's time stop ability is probably one of the more dangerous powers at this stage in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Yes, future characters in later parts do have much more powerful stands, as well as more creative abilities. Yes, Bunny Valentine, your day will come someday. Maybe if this video gets 1 million views or something, I don't know. I highly doubt that'll happen. The world has another meaning in the Arcana, and one that I really feel reflects Dio as a character in Part 3, which is what this section will really focus on. While the world does signify completion while in the upright position, it can also signify when you are near completing your goals, which is what Dio is essentially at in his conquest. When the Joestar Egyptian group finally made their way to Dio's hiding place, he was all but fully recovered. He was so close to taking back the world at night. The only real obstacle was the Joestars that had searched through the sands of Egypt to stop him, and one that while he still had a bit of worry for, after all, he had learned about the tenacity of the Joestar bloodline against Jonathan. While Dio still possesses egotism, he also became a lot more careful in his approach with the Joestars. He didn't rush into battle all willy-nilly against Joseph, aware that the power of Haman could still affect him. And when Jotaro Kujo seemed to display his ability to move through Dio's frozen world, Dio did whatever he could to make sure that Jotaro was only playing a joke on the guy. And then when Jotaro actually enters his world, Dio becomes a lot more creative with his powers and abilities. Even when he believes that Jotaro is alive, even if there's just a fraction of a chance that Jotaro is, Dio keeps his distance from the downed Jojo, even listening to see if there was a heartbeat in the teen's body. This to me shows that Dio grew as a character when it came to his abilities in fighting, because while he does have a more overwhelming power that is growing every time he uses it, he cannot afford to underestimate his opponents, especially the little brat who apparently has the same power as him. Dio vs Jotaro is probably one of my more favorite fights in the animated series, as it really does ramp up the tension between the two, along with a crisp animation that spans over the course of several episodes. It does make the fight quite the nail-biter. And of course, Dio's demented tactics lead one to the most iconic moments in all of the series, and maybe in anime. There's just something cathartic about watching a teenager getting crushed by a road roller. And before you take that out of context, it's not like we had this moment.
Watch out!
Dio just made one major mistake.
You pissed me off.
I mean, anyone can piss off Jotaro easily, so can you really call that a mistake on Dio's part? And to top it off, Dio knows that he's the cream of the crop. He's the best of the best. He's got probably one of the most abusable stands in the series. On a side note, if you're wondering about the tanks on the world's back, apparently Araki designed that on purpose because he wanted Dio to be able to breathe during the stop time. Which makes some sense, I guess. And to make things more interesting, the world was the first stand that Araki actually designed, and was the beginning of the JoJo villain's trend of messing with the aspect of time. Sure, Dio is strong as a character, and can even play mind tricks with his stand the world, like how he did with Polnareff. But I think another aspect of Dio that makes him dangerous is his manipulative tendencies. And this is something that we talked about before. However, what we're looking at here is essentially a deal with the devil. Oftentimes, Dio is shown to be a master of manipulation with the stand users in the third part, whether it be through terror, using his flesh buds, or other ways. Dio was a threat. And even after his death, he was still a threat throughout the rest of the original universe's run. His ideology and plans lasting for far longer than even him. I'll talk about part 6 in a later segment of this video, but there's one more thing I want to bring up before we get to that part. This won't be a long chapter, but one that needs to be brought up. When it comes to villains, especially your main villain, they need to be a foil to the main character of your story. While foils aren't exclusive to villains, I feel like foils are the best way to think about your villains, since they're supposed to oppose the main character of your story, as well as act as a contrast to the characters in order to highlight their attributes. This is for both villains and heroes. Now, for say someone like Jonathan Joestar, that's actually quite easy. Mainly because Jonathan's about as entertaining as a piece of wood. Careful not to rub two sticks together near him or you might have a spark of personality there. I'm obviously joking when I say that, but there is quite a bit of contrast between the two characters, aside from the obvious other upbringings which I already covered. Characterization, Jonathan is often portrayed as a dorky nice guy, while Dio is an ambitious, evil street rat. Jojo wants to be a perfect gentleman, willing to risk himself for strangers. Dio loves to exploit people and kill dogs. And there goes my monetization. Thanks, YouTube! When it comes to the supernatural abilities they acquire, they're also opposing, with Haman and vampirism being the obvious there. Even their color choices are often in contrast to each other, especially after they get their powers, where Jonathan is often wearing blue while Dio wears red. I think it's also telling that when Jojo has defeated Dio, Dio grows to form a sort of respect to Jonathan, even to the point where Dio sees Jonathan being the only acceptable replacement for his new body. He even chastises his lackey who gives Jonathan disrespect. And funnily enough, one could even see that Dio understood that Jonathan's affection, even in the last moments as Jojo held Dio's head in his dying arms, that Jonathan was sincere. If it wasn't for Jonathan, Dio wouldn't have a new body to take him to the new world. Dio saw Jonathan as the only person he's ever accepted as an equal, even when he was willing to kill Jonathan to save his own skin. Then if we were to compare him to the third Jojo we follow, Jotaro Kujo, there's even more of a contrast between the two. Even the structure of the story plays with this, since Jotaro was on the hunt for Dio to save his mother. Meanwhile, Dio is staying hidden within Cairo while his body adjusts and he practices with his stand. Other aspects to Dio being a foil with Jotaro, Dio tends to be over the top and present himself with enough charisma to make others loyal to his vampiric abs, but also willing to throw them away at a moment's notice. Jotaro starts off by telling his mother to "Shut up! Get out of my face, you bitch!" and is seen to be so stoic that often think that Jotaro is unable to show any actual emotions. However, that's a mask. Jotaro does care for others and has a good sense of justice and is surprisingly intelligent for a guy who looks like this. In that vein, Dio's really open with his personality, while Jotaro often hides his actual personality under his rough exterior. Heck, even their color codes are actually in distinction. Dio's primary colors in Part 3 are surprisingly bright yellow and gold, meanwhile Jotaro's got all his black coloring to him. I think because these two characters have such a contrast to each other that adds to the memorability of their battle in the streets of Cairo. When you see a clash of two completely different characters that have a lot of diametric elements, it becomes enthralling to watch them cross blows, play mind games with each other, and how the fight twists and turns. If you wanted to really get into the nitty-gritty of things though, Dio actively embraced the culture of Cairo and even says this line in the manga: "I outsmarted you. Don't you recognize this street I'm flying down? Or do all of the streets look the same to a tourist?" That line implies that Dio probably is more familiar with the streets of Cairo, which makes the idea of him going out at night often. And we also see that Dio is capable of navigating the streets to find the knives and even the road roller. Because, yeah, when you think about it, Jotaro is a tourist, and Dio is an actual resident of Cairo. And going back to their outfits, Jotaro does wear his home country's culture literally on his sleeve, what with his uniform. Meanwhile, Dio's baggy pants and cropped jacket aren't exactly unheard of in several Middle Eastern cultures, including Egypt. Even the ring bracelets and curled shoes that Dio wears are also reminiscent of that culture. So one could say that Dio embraced the culture, while Jotaro didn't. Jotaro vs. Dio is probably one of the most iconic fights in the series, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of people who will say that there are a lot more fights that are memorable, and hey, that's fine. Not everyone can be right at all the time, especially when it comes to personal preferences. Still, I would argue that Dio is probably one of the most important characters within the original universe's timeline and has far-reaching implications for each part. Him being a foil to the characters just being part of that reason for that.
Get back, Jojo!
This is the part of the video where I talk about some of the less than specific aspects of Dio's character and actually reflects today's modern writing. Dio as a character throughout JoJo has a unique role, especially in the original universe part, that there's a shadow of Dio in the parts after 3. I stated earlier that Dio was probably one of Araki's favorite characters to draw, and I feel as though because of that, Dio's influence throughout the series has managed to ring true throughout the very least the original universe, at least to some degree. To make a long story short, let's consider the following. It was because of the bow and arrow that was used to give Dio his own stand powers that kicked off the events of Morio, especially in regards to Kira getting his own stand. His own flesh and blood, Giorno became the main protagonist of Part 5, although his connection to Dio didn't really come up at all, but I digress. I mean, I would have killed to have Polnareff have a reaction to learning that Giorno was Dio's kid.
You what?
And in Part 6, Stone Ocean, Dio's teaching and relationship with Father Pucci, Well, I'm sure you can guess from there, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Dio's shadow is cast over the entirety of the original universe's storyline, so when you have Jotaro saying that Dio is the Joestar family enemy, he isn't kidding. Even in death, Dio's influence and scorn still managed to resurface. And on a meta level, Dio started a lot of trends when it comes to JoJo villains, being over the top, having insane quirks, and having a time and space reality bending stand. Although if you really think about it, Dio's motivations are really basic and standard fare for villains. He wants to create an ideal world, one where he reigns supreme over everyone, basically taking over the world. Initially through his time-stopping ability and through his plans with Pucci to reset the world. I do think we need to talk about Pucci a little bit for this, since this does open up quite a bit of characterization for Dio, even if it's done retroactively and through flashbacks. Something that the heroes would never really know in the actual story. Because through the interactions with Pucci, we do see a different side of Dio, one that's more methodical and more inquisitive. This isn't trying to make Dio into less of a villain, but rarely do we get to see these kinds of moments where the main villains are just talking in normal conversation with another person. I think his conversations with Pucci, not only do we see some oddities with Dio's personality, like him building a model ship while talking to the young priest, and that can gleam a few interesting thoughts. Especially when we consider that he has the lifeboats out from the model and his ultimate hiding place was a desert. It's kind of funny when you think about it, especially when you consider that Dio spent about 100 years at the bottom of the ocean. It's elements like these that aren't explicitly told in the text, but are shown in the artwork and thinking back to the characters' events in their life that do flesh out the characters a bit more. These kinds of thoughts can elude the audience since it's more of a background storytelling and not shoved in your face, which is something you can really appreciate when you go back a few times to watch and read the material, and it really gets you thinking about the characters. If you recall when we talked about Dio's backstory about how he was abused as a child, watched his own mother dying before his very eyes by the bastard he had to call a father, and how time and classism of that period turned his father into a monster, Dio's ultimate goal, as revealed in part 6, makes a lot of sense. His goal, revealed in conversations with Pucci, is to acquire heaven, or to acquire happiness. Dario's a bastard, no doubt about that. But I doubt the guy became a drunk abuser because he was satisfied with his life, and in turn, Dio became a monster as well because of this unhappiness, even going so far to kill his father, killing a dog, and killing his adopted father. Throughout Dio's life, he had been attempting to rectify the issues that plagued him. He's a street rat, steal the riches. Been abused, become essentially invincible. Be considered nothing more than dirt by other people, lord over them as the absolute ruler of the world. And ultimately, as he says,
Joy cannot be found by having an invincible body, vast riches, or even reigning over all humanity. In the end, the true winner is the one who gets to witness heaven.
As I've stated, you gotta remember this guy spent about 100 years with just himself and the corpse of Jonathan Joestar at the bottom of the sea, and he was an ever-living creature, left with only his thoughts and reflecting on the 20 years that he was actually alive before being confined to this very coffin at the bottom of the ocean. It's glossed over this fact, but I think it's an interesting thought process to consider Dio's position as a villain. And it makes more sense when you consider his plans to transform the world into Made in Heaven. Which, remember, Pucci's plan was Dio's plan, and the entire concept was to basically anticipate what the future would hold, that he would be the only man who constantly knows what was going to happen, what he was going to experience, and that he could be the only one to change it. It makes perfect sense considering that Dio's goals and ambitions were always snuffed out before they could really succeed, and who among us wouldn't want to change the past? And it was this plan that continued on within the man called Pucci. Dio's confidant, I think, would be a good word to use since Pucci was treated almost like an equal to him in their conversations, Dio even being pushed back a little by Pucci on things. And there was a lot of depth to Dio's character, and a lot of information that isn't explicitly stated in the series. Granted, a lot of people are more familiar with the memes associated with the character, as well as his appearance and fight within Part 3, which is probably one of the more iconic parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Dio's character is one of complexity when you look beyond the surface of his flashy appearance, and while he's totally written to be inexcusable, Araki has masterfully crafted a villain that has a lot more depth than what a lot of people would give credit towards. Dio is evil. Dio has reasons for being evil. But Dio doesn't apologize for his motives for the things that he does. Throw in the fact that Dio is probably one of the more visually appealing characters in JoJo, as well as how his visual presence works greatly with the series, it's no wonder why Dio's got a lot of love sent his way, even if he does some of the worst shit in the entire series. Hold up, do I really need to explain this one? I just got done telling you guys that there's a lot to Dio and why he's an amazing villain. His backstory is tragic, his abilities are dangerous, and he has more depth to him than the Ariana Trench. And even in death, he acts as the overarching villain for the entire first half of the series. It's clear that Dio was one of the most enticing antagonists ever made. He's a terrible threat to the protagonist, and he's teaming with not only stellar charisma, but he also represents the entirety of the franchise of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Everything that Dio does represents the over-the-top insanity that comes with the series. And he's a prominent figure of pop culture. Many people are aware of his iconic quotes before watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure because of the memes that spawn from this character. Dio, while a character who has depth to him, is also just an evil bastard who revels in every single evil action that he performed. And his evil haunted the Joestars even after his actual death. An evil like Dio never truly dies. And frankly, he's probably what a lot of villains should be nowadays. If you made it this part of the video, I appreciate you watching, and I think we should cap this off with seeing how many of you made it by typing in the comments, "Kono Dio da!" I appreciate your time, thank you for watching this essay, and it's because of viewers like you that I can make these kinds of videos, and I hope to keep making them. Thank you so much for all your time, patience, and everything that you have done for me. I'm MangaKamen, thanks for watching, and don't forget to go...
Think of this as a gift, so I will allow you to know now. What you witnessed and felt was your future self laid bare. I obliterated time, then leapt beyond it. It doesn't matter who it is. I shall never allow any cretin to threaten my eternal transcendence. Not ever.
JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is known for a lot of things. The over-the-top nature, the odd humor, or in the case of this video, its villains. A lot of JoJo's rogues gallery are some of the more iconic villains in anime. Whether it be the vampire who's obsessed with the JoJo family, the serial killer who's obsessed with hands, or even the President of the United States of America. Never been proud to be an American. Yes, I will talk about the President one day. Your comments have not been ignored. But today we're talking about one of the more overlooked villains of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Diavolo of Part 5. And to be frank, it's kinda hard not to see why, especially considering that his motivation, even in the series he's in, is nothing more than a man in the shadows, looking to be the king of the world, while at the same time not being known. It's actually logical if you think about it. If you're a well-known figure of a crime organization that allows people to rise up in the ranks by killing others, you essentially paint a target on your back. Of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Today we'll be diving deep into the man who burns his past away. I'm MangaKamen, and prepare yourselves.
Now may the fires of hell embrace you.
When you talk about JoJo villains, there's a lot you can glean from the characters, especially when we look at how Araki develops them. With Yoshikage Kira, he had elements of David Bowie for the design and elements of serial killers that Araki had researched. Dio was more or less inspired to be one of the worst villains of all time, not poorly written mind you, but to be an evil bastard that the audience would love to hate. But for Diavolo, well, as much as I couldn't find a lot of information on the development of Diavolo.
Ironic.
Maybe it's because I'm a lazy bastard and I couldn't find that little nugget of information about him, but the most I could find is this quote. It was shocking how, in the movie Total Recall, there was a guy with an extra face on his belly, with its own personality. For Diavolo, I thought he would look punk if his hair had a leopard pattern.
That can't be it. Where's the rest of it?
I like Total Recall as much as the next guy, but in all honesty, I really can't stretch that out for a good 5 minutes with this segment, so we'll do the next best thing. We'll establish who Diavolo is. Diavolo is the main antagonist of JoJo Part 5, the boss of the Passion, the mafia that has its hands in several different kinds of crimes across Italy. He's also the founder of this organization, and it's an organization that specializes in secrecy, since if they were out in the open, that would make them targets of assassination and law enforcement. Considering that Diavolo was a man who values his privacy to an extreme manner, even to the point that he uses an actual alternate personality that causes physical changes, this works. It's actually an interesting thought process, since if you consider the nature of crimes and by extent the mafia, working in the shadows and hiding your own power from prying eyes of authority makes sense with Diavolo's paranoia. Throw in the fact that the Passione has several stand users, of which their abilities cannot be seen by regular people, you can easily have your crimes be committed with your stand and most people wouldn't be none the wiser. I mean, even if a guy did explode outwards with a car. Our protagonist, Giorno Giovanna, does that in the opening of part 5. So there is potential, and if we look towards the villains previously in JoJo, Diavolo actually continues a trend. If you really consider the actions and conditions for each of the villains of previous parts, they had a reason or another to hide at one point. Dio in part 1 had to hide his true motivations while he was human for years, and when he became a vampire and was defeated by Jonathan, he had to hide in order to recover. The Pillarmen, while I wouldn't say are cowardly, they had the same aversion to sunlight. In Dio Part 3, he had to recover and get used to his new body, all the while keeping himself hidden from the Joestars while he trained for, using the world. In Kira in Part 4, well, I don't think I have to say anything about this guy, if you know anything about him. What I'm trying to get at is that a lot of the villains in JoJo, even in future parts, will often hide themselves to some degree or another. While stand users will inevitably come crossing each other's paths, that doesn't stop the villains from hiding themselves from the heroes or enemy stand users. Diavolo is probably one of the more extreme ones, well, save for maybe...
I don't get it.
But that's probably for another video at another time. We're talking about the man who was willing to go so far to protect his identity that he was willing to kill his only daughter so people couldn't trace him from her. Man, this should have been the video with the surf shark ad so I can make a joke about not having to pay such a heavy price so you could hide your identity. God, I'm such an idiot. Regardless of your narrator's intelligence level, I will fully admit that Diavolo is not exactly the most discussed of villains, mainly due to the fact that his character is to be a mystery. That's the point of a man whose goal is to not exist in the mind of others but controlling the world of crime from the shadows. In a sense, Diavolo's motivation is actually similar to that of Kira's, to indulge in his vice and not have a worry in the world because of it. It's a shame since the aspect of mystery of Diavolo is extremely dangerous. In comparison to Dio and Kira, with Dio, we and the heroes know exactly who Dio is. But the true measure of his abilities were what made the Joestar Egyptian tour group wary of Dio and try to hurry up to kill him when they were in his lair. In contrast with Kira, while we the audience know his abilities and when he adopts a new identity, we are aware of what he looks like, the Mario group doesn't know this. Diavolo is actually a combination of both those mysterious elements, where we as the audience and the characters don't know what he looks like or what his abilities are, at least not until it's too late. Even after we see his abilities, we still don't know exactly who Diavolo is. Although the Doppio scenes do kind of give away that something isn't quite right. God, what a freak. Yeah, we'll be talking a little bit about Doppio in this too. I mean, the two are essentially two sides of the same coin. However, we as the audience do get to learn more about the character, about how his birth was nearly impossible, about how he was born in an all-female prison with no father of a 2-year pregnancy. Not that it really matters in the grand scheme of things in the overall plot of JoJo. When he was 19, he had faked his own death, all the while killing a few other people in the process. What'd he do after that? Well, he decided to go to Egypt, for some reason, to join an excavation. Well, he was the one who did find the arrowheads that allow people to gain the power of stands, selling most of them, save for one, for great money, and then formed the Passione when he returned to Italy. It's not really a lot to be learned about Diavolo, at least with the official material. There's a lot of fan theories, but as we stated on this channel multiple times, theories are just theories. Nothing more, nothing less. But for now, we'll be referring to what makes Diavolo to be a threat.
Think for a moment. Is anyone worthier? Can you name even one person? You know that I alone am worthy of becoming king!
One of the key elements that I've said in all my videos is that to have an effective villain, you need to be able to have them be a threat, especially if they're intended to be that way. If they're not threatening, what's the point? If the heroes aren't going to take the villains seriously, why should the audience? This ties into the point I made in the last segment, that Diavolo has a unique situation in JoJo, and it's one of his greatest strengths, that if you don't know who he is, you'll never be able to defeat him because of his stand's ability. Which, hey, since I brought it up, we might as well talk about his stand's abilities before we get to his proper introduction. Diavolo's stand, King Crimson, has two prominent abilities: the ability to erase time for up to 10 seconds, and his ability to see in the future. although that second one is due to his sub-stand called Epitaph. Two stand abilities work in tandem with each other. Epitaph forecasts the future, projected in Diavolo's hair. Whatever his stand projects is 100% fated to happen. And this is where his main stand ability comes into play, King Crimson. That allows him to skip time up to 10 seconds. When activated, all will move along the predestined paths that were projected by Epitaph. Everyone but Diavolo himself. Everyone affected will have no control on what they will do during the time skip, and will have no memory of what happened. Diavolo, on the other hand, is free to move wherever he wants. In return, he cannot interact with anything. He essentially phases through it, and anything he interacts with will ignore him. He's immune from physical attacks and cannot attack anyone during the time skip. In that case, he basically just repositions himself for strategic purposes. The best example would be when he's fighting Bucciarati, since he was able to keep himself hidden from view with only his stand actually being fully visible to the character and the audience at the time. And this power actually works extremely well with a character like Diavolo. Diavolo's nature is that of a paranoid person, and one of the aspects of paranoia is the anticipatory fear of the unknown. So with the power of Epitaph, Diavolo can plan ahead and change his strategies. Considering some of his personality traits, this is especially fitting, so he wouldn't have to worry about what'll happen to him. Without this power, Diavolo would be a lot easier to catch off guard, since he does seem to be pretty reliant on its powers to predict his opponent's moves. It can also be symbolic of the fact that Diavolo was actually pretty short-sighted, despite his long-term plans. There's also the fact that these two abilities can be used in collaboration. Epitaph on its own predicts the future, and what happens in that 10 seconds of time is set in stone. But when used with time skip, Diavolo can avoid the prediction's outcome entirely. Diavolo claims that this is all due to fate. For the 10-second time skipped, everyone but him follows their fates to the letter. To point out, there were some discrepancies with how King Crimson actually worked due to how the manga had portrayed it, but the anime has managed to clear up a few misconceptions. At least that's how I figured in my research. But when you couple this with his personality and secretive nature, it's a deadly combination that works well to his advantage. When you look towards some of the previous villains with their stance and consider their powers, they match pretty well with the villains' personalities. Dio viewed himself to be above all mankind, and he wasn't wrong. And a power that effectively could shut down other stands and anything else fits with a man who sees himself as the greatest living organism in the world. Kira, on the other hand, was a man who wanted to live a quiet life while indulging in his personal vices. As such, Killer Queen had the ability to create bombs in secret as well as remove any sort of trace of who Kira really was. Diavolo was in the same vein with his powers, which not only allowed him to see into the future, but also properly plan for it, so he could effectively keep his identity secret. To be fair, Diavolo is quite the coward. He believes that the past, no matter how insignificant it may seem, can be used against someone. As such, he does everything he can to protect his identity and preserve his anonymity, including trying to kill his own child. It's because of this cowardice and paranoia that spurs Diavolo into becoming frantic. It's almost like a cornered animal, and because of that desperation, they will lash out worse than you would think. It's why when the Hitman team, when they asked for territory and a raise, Diavolo turned them down. They began to search for his information. One of their members, Sorbet, was sliced up alive and the other, Gelato, committed suicide. By sending this message, Sorbet's body was frozen in formaldehyde and framed, sent to the Hitman team. Truly a gruesome message. It should be noted that Diavolo actually managed to get quite a few kills due to his short-sighted tactics, however. He managed to kill Bucciarati, Abbacchio, and Narancia. In addition to Polnareff, if you want to throw in Doppio, he defeated Rosetto. Technically. There's a lot to be said about Diavolo's abilities, but then there's also Doppio, a second skin as it were, which is a fictional version of DID, dissociative identity disorder, or as some people like to view it a long time ago, multiple personalities. I need to make it clear that it's a fictional version of this, since I'm pretty sure DID doesn't change a person's height and body type. Now, I'm not here to talk about if it's a proper representation of the disorder. I'm pretty sure that the source that Araki used for the story was outdated anyway, so you can't really look for much realism, especially with the inclusion of the physical changes when alters change. I'm pretty sure this isn't a symptom of a disorder. I just want to make it clear I'm not a psychologist, nor is this the point of the video, so please don't get in my case for that. Instead, the fact is that he has an alternate personality to use to his advantage. Since Doppio tends to be a really loyal person to Diavolo, the mob boss can use another skin to walk around in the day. Hell, the fact that Doppio seems to be more innocent as a character also plays into that, since people often view that as someone who couldn't possibly be related to the boss. And yet, Abbacchio faced that same challenge. So there's a lot of potential for Diavolo to be a villain and utilize his abilities to do so. However, like a lot of villains, he has his own weaknesses. And that comes from his...
What are all these dragons made of metal?
There is a recurring element in JoJo, and that is fate. There are many characters in the series of JoJo that will often reference fate, such as no matter how strong or weak, all Stan users are destined to meet one another. That's a fact. Diavolo is no different. It's an obsession of his, where he believes that it guides his life and that fate can control the action of all things, and that he is the one who can control that. Consider, if you will, that there are fortune tellers within the story of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and oftentimes they are considered to be a lot more credible in the world of JoJo. And as we've stated in the last part, one of Diavolo's powers is that he can see about 10 seconds into the future. And there are multiple times where Diavolo will say that it's his fate, or that he's assured of his victory.
But it's not defeat! It may not be now, but victory will be mine! I'm coming to crush your skull properly this time, as fate ordained! The future can only hold one of us, and it has chosen me!
But considering my last line in the previous section, this raises the question. This is a weakness? Well, yeah. Every one of the villains in JoJo has a weakness, and oftentimes it has to do with their own personality quirks, and it comes from egotism as well. Dio and Cars believed that they were the greatest creatures in the world. Kira shouted his name out when he believed that he had conquered his enemies, and later on Pucci would believe that his ability to predict all actions that would happen led him to his death at the hands of a Stan that had almost once defeated him before. Diavolo is no different, as his arrogance and belief in his ability to accept what fate sets before him unironically caused him to make some very serious mistakes. Let's take, for example, the arrows. One could argue that it was fate that guided Diavolo to find the arrows that he sold all but one, and then he gave that one to one of his lackeys to create new Stan use. Why is this an issue? It plays into Diavolo's short-sightedness. Without thinking on testing them beyond getting a stand and recruits, because of this, later on, this decision would create a stand that would defeat him. And his attempts to go back on that decision in the last part of the fight would lead to his final defeat. He already had the arrow in his hands many years ago, but due to him wanting to get results immediately, it cost him the possibility to get a greater power. The Hitman team merely asked for a raise in some territory, something that pretty much every other team in the Passion had, and Diavolo said no. And while killing Sorbet and Gelato sent a clear message to not search for his identity, simply trying to work with a very competent, effective, and dangerous assassin team would have been a much better compromise and would have netted him a stronger and more loyal team. Instead of waiting for Trish to be delivered to him, as was the plan, and when Bucciarati's gone, Diavolo could kill Trish on his own time. The mob boss just decides to snatch her away from Bucciarati at the last second. Sure, Diavolo does have the power to kill Bucciarati, and does so. It saved him a headache, however, especially when he's well aware of Bucciarati's nature and skill as a stand user, as well as pretty much everyone else who's outside the building.
I gloved up!
There are a number of other things that we have to consider with this, but these are some of the bigger issues of Diavolo's short-sightedness, and it goes into play with his fatal character flaw, how he's willing to get short-term success without considering the long-term ramifications of his decision. Now, am I saying this makes him a bad villain? No. No, I am not. Just because a villain makes mistakes like these, that doesn't mean that they're a bad character. The fact that a lot of these issues stem from Diavolo's paranoia add to his humanization. While his motivations for starting the Passion are exactly clear, we do need to consider that before he went to Egypt, he did effectively destroy his identity and lit a town on fire because of it. So ever since then, the shadow of paranoia of someone possibly discovering him and his crimes could be considered to be clawing at his back. That's understandable when you consider that Diavolo didn't just go for the short-term wins, and had thought out his situations more, he'd probably be a lot more successful as a villain. Then again, if we looked at any of the villains and point out their flaws in hindsight, and as an outside third party who isn't actually part of the story, anyone can make these observations. Hell, one could easily argue that there was a great risk to testing the arrow on a stand, since not every person who gets stabbed with the arrow becomes a stand user. Some of them die, or it wouldn't even be possible to do so considering that stands aren't exactly made out of physical material. The reason I'm bringing these up is to talk about the character flaw, his paranoia. His short-sighted decisions and his obsession with fate do blind him to the issues that his plans would spawn. It's a mixture of personal issues which can cause Diavolo to perform some seriously terrible acts and at the same time open up to a lot more issues and problems in the future. And I honestly think that's pretty good. I think it's humanizing that he makes mistakes like this. It doesn't mean he's a bad villain, it just means that he's a very troubled person.
Oh, I get it! I get jokes.
When I make my videos talking about villains, one of my favorite parts is when I make a comparison to the protagonists of their series, and if they act as a good foil. Because when you look towards a hero, you need to look towards their villain or antagonist as well, since the point of a hero is to have them challenged in the story, not just physically, not just through combat, but also through characterization. We love to watch heroes overcome the challenges thrown towards them, and villains are a great way of doing that. JoJo is a bit of a different beast when it comes to the style of hero's journey, especially when it comes to its protagonists. A good portion of the time, while the heroes are challenged in fights and such, there isn't really great development cycle for the characters to grow, at least a good portion of the time. I do not want to come off as if I'm generalizing the entire work in that regard, because there's a lot of development for many characters, but in part 5, part of the reason why Giorno to shine as a protagonist is because he's so gung-ho about his goal about becoming a gangstar. If you're not familiar with Giorno's backstory, the kid didn't really have a happy childhood. He was neglected by his mother, abused by his second father, was bullied relentlessly for being a foreigner, and was the son of Dio. I know that sounds like an afterthought, especially considering that Dio was one of the most iconic villains in JoJo, but that's because it was an afterthought, and never really ties into the actual plot or story of Part 5. That's for a different video down the line though. I mean, if you want that video, please consider typing in the comments, Golden Wind! And give this video a like. Once you do, we'll make a video talking about everyone's golden boy, Giorno Giovanna, when we hit 10k likes. Shilling aside, the point I'm trying to get at was that Giorno had a very rough childhood, and it wasn't until he actually found his dream after helping a gangster escape from death that things managed to turn around for him, and it was his inspiration to go out and seek his dream. If you think about it, Giorno is willing to do whatever he can to fulfill his dream, even putting himself in the line of fire. You know, standard fare for a heroic character. Meanwhile, in comparison to that of Diavolo, a character who did actually grow up in a rather privileged location, Diavolo is a coward. Giorno throughout the series is willing to take risks and gambles, relying on his teammates numerous times to get the job done if he can't do it. Diavolo, on the other hand, is willing to use anyone and everyone as a tool, prepared to destroy them if they fail him or go against him. In addition, while he's not afraid to sully his own hands with these deeds, he does so more in the shadows, only forced out into the open when he has no other choice in the matter. One could even argue that Diavolo is a foil to the rest of the main cast of Part 5, as each of them had their own terrible pasts but managed to get ahead of it because they worked together. This then ties into another aspect that goes well with the characters in Diavolo, a good foil to each other. And that, my friends, is trust. Diavolo is a paranoid megalomaniac who only cares about himself, with his fascination over fate honestly causing him to make mistakes or to outright deny the fate that he fails to see. Then you look over at Team Bucciarati, a team that is filled with misfits, each of them with their own terrible fates that were shackled onto them. But the team has a great level of trust between them all, with trust being a very necessary aspect, especially in the world of the Mafia. If you read or watch Team Bucciarati, it's pretty evident that trust is a major component on how they work.
Tabacchio! I hope for all our sakes, you're not letting a hang-up get in the way of survival.
I can't reveal my stand to just anyone, especially a complete stranger who has zero loyalty to me.
And one of the key traits of the Giorno story is to gain the trust of the crew.
Come what may, I refuse to give up my dream.
What the hell does that mean?
Go on! Solve it then! Don't let me down!
Giorno!
Whereas Diavolo has no trust in those around him. Giorno opens himself up to the group, even going so far as to risk his life so he can gain the trust of them. Also drinking piss, but that's neither here or there. Sure, he's doing it for the sake of his dream, but as the story goes on, we see that Giorno generally does care for the Bucciarati group.
That's now in your skull! I win!
What? Mista. Your determination. It shines even brighter than the morning sun, and it's put us on the path toward tomorrow. We've won because of you.
What the hell?
It's a genuine bond, and that's something that Diavolo refuses himself to have. Even when his right hand in alternate persona, Doppio gets tossed away to die, leaving Diavolo all alone to try to acquire the arrow. And it really was a combination of the remainder of Team Bucciarati that managed to get the arrow to Giorno and allowing him to evolve his stand into Requiem. I like to think that this is an interesting way to consider the dynamic between Giorno and Diavolo, especially since they don't really get a lot of characterization with each other, which is probably the best way you can do this sort of thing, considering that Diavolo's goal is to remain hidden and as well matches paranoia. For those who don't know about paranoia, one of the more common definitions is as such, suspicion or distrust of others, and as you can imagine, it makes it very hard to have confidence with other people, so Diavolo built up walls around him so he could protect himself. All the while, Giorno lowered whatever walls he had in order to earn the trust of Team Bucciarati, and in turn, he could trust them, much like how he puts his faith into Bucciarati himself. There are other parallels that one could make, such as how we're shown that while Giorno is quite strong, he's pretty much quiet as a protagonist. In fact, that's probably one of the major issues that a lot of people have with Giorno, that he's kind of bland. He doesn't really boast all that much, and in comparison, Diavolo has such a twisted ego that he actually believes that fate is on his side, even to the point where he feels like he's entitled to the power, making plenty of speeches about it. It's his destiny! Or look towards their stand abilities. Much like how Josuke and Kira's powers were opposing, one could view the same between Giorno and Diavolo. Giorno's gold experience has a similar healing utility of that of Josuke's crazy diamond. However, not only does it allow Giorno to use it on himself, but he can also technically bring back the dead, albeit temporarily. One could even consider that going against fate. Again, temporarily. Gold Experience's main ability is to give life, and that could be seen as a selfless act, incorporated into a stand. Meanwhile, King Crimson has a similar effect that allows him to bypass fate, or in Diavolo's mind, control it. Ultimately, it's a selfish power, as the world itself practically freezes and Diavolo can position himself however he wants in those precious few seconds. It's even funnier when you realize that Time Erasure cannot directly control the world while he erases the time. He can only position himself, meaning it's only focused on him. A completely selfish power. You could obviously say I'm stretching with these, but I don't know, I think these are rather fun ideas to consider when you're looking at a villain and a hero and how they can contrast with each other, even down to their abilities, design, and concepts.
Think fast, Chuckle Nuts!
Diavolo was a contentious villain, and it's mostly due to his mysterious nature. On one hand, the concept of a villain so powerful that he hides his presence from everyone and he could potentially be the person next to you is an element that even the part played with.
Rice Pirate!
But by that same token, a lot of people see Diavolo as a villain with less personality, not helped by the fact that we don't really get a lot of insight on how he is the way he is. Even more so, as the split personality element between him and Doppio isn't exactly expanded upon, and is more or less left up to mystery as well. That isn't a bad thing per se, since not every villain needs to have a backstory that is so tightly woven that there's no actual debate to be had about the character. Frankly speaking, while looking for research for this video, there were a lot of things that did open my eyes to not only Diavolo as a villain, but Part 5 as a whole. Diavolo, the devil, his stand is terrifying and his behavior is unpredictable, and when rewatching and rereading it makes you really consider how that made him a very scary villain and to think about. I love how his two stands are references to the band King Crimson in a song of their first album, Epitaph. And if you want to go even further than that, you can talk about how Diavolo himself is a 21st century schizoid man, which is the first track on that same album. Oh, Rocky, your musical references never cease to amaze me. There is a lot to talk about with the villains of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I'm glad people are at the very least enjoying the videos that I talk about them. So, I guess the only thing I can say now is, I'm MangaKamen. Thanks for watching, and arrivederci!